Hey Dunchbags, what's going on? It's Landon Remixes here, and it is time for my review of the fourth studio album from the British progressive trance trio Above and Beyond. This one is called Common Ground. Common Ground is the follow-up to Above and Beyond's 2015 album, We Are All We Need, which, fun fact, was the very first album I ever reviewed on this channel. While I do, to this day, still think We Are All We Need is a pretty decent record, to say the least, I definitely overrated it at the time of my review. I actually went and revisited Above and Beyond's entire discography in preparation for this review, and looking back on it, really, We Are All We Need was their least progressive album by far. While the album definitely wasn't obnoxiously terrible, it also really didn't do much to push the trio forward. It was a pretty middle-of-the-road album. Although there are definitely some things that I'd say made We Are All We Need a special album. One of those being that it followed in the footsteps of Above and Beyond's acoustic album pretty well. There were definitely a lot of remnants from the acoustic album kind of resurfacing on We Are All We Need. For example, the song Making Plans from the acoustic album was kind of reworked to fit on the We Are All We Need album, and then, of course, the acoustic album's primary vocalist, Alex Vargas, was kind of introduced to sing on a number of Above and Beyond's different songs on the We Are All We Need album. That's just a couple different parallels. Though, looking back on it today, I honestly wish that influence was even more present on We Are All We Need. In fact, I would have been totally okay with Above and Beyond putting out an entire album of, like, acoustic or maybe rock-leaning originals. Although, given that Above and Beyond really is the face of the progressive trance scene, it is highly unlikely that their fans would really be okay with that. And that's kind of where my general problems with Above and Beyond start to begin. They're a group that possesses a ton of talent, but they never really let their full potential be unlocked because they seem to be afraid of what fans will think if they try to step outside the box. And for that reason, we get an album like Common Ground, which essentially uses the same exact formula as their last album. And just to be fair, I'll throw Group Therapy in there as well, even though that's my favorite Above and Beyond album. You've got the same vocalists, the same chord progressions, the same big euphoric EDM drops, and that's just generally speaking, but really this album is so similar to We Are All We Need, although my review can't just end there, so I guess I'll have to go a little bit deeper. Common Ground is not terrible, don't get me wrong, it's not. It's just really, really safe. And while for that reason this album might be a bit hard to love, it's also really hard to hate too. Really, this album's biggest crime is just that it parallels the last two albums a little too much. And in some places on this album, I honestly think there were some improvements from We Are All We Need. I think a large part of that comes in the form of this album's lyricism, which, if I'm being honest, rounds out as a bit more mature than their last two albums. As much as I hate to admit it in the case of Group Therapy, that album and We Are All We Need suffered from some really cheesy lyricism. Although, needless to say, I think We Are All We Need ended up suffering a little bit more. Thankfully, the lyrics on Common Ground don't sound like they were written for a 13-year-old who's going through their first breakup. In fact, the lyrics sound a bit more like adult contemporary music to me. Common Ground also sees the triumphant return of Richard Bedford, who's one of Above and Beyond's really long-time collaborators. He had been kind of off their music for a little while. He didn't participate in either of the acoustic projects or their last album, We Are All We Need, kind of being replaced with Alex Vargas, who I noted sounds strangely similar to Richard Bedford, and I think that was on purpose. But he's back, and he's back on this album, and I think he's got a great voice, and in a lot of places I really like the appearances he was making. Maybe not as much as on Group Therapy, but they're still pretty good. Northern Soul is one of the tracks in particular that featured Richard Bedford that I really enjoyed. And really not just for its vocals, but I think this is one of the better, more well-rounded out productions in the entire album. This song reminds me a lot of Sticky Fingers from the last album, largely because it starts out the track with kind of a more dark and minimal sound, and then proceeds into a more melodic drop toward the end of the track. Except that one, I think, had a little bit more of an electro vibe to it, and this one, to me, the intro sounds a little bit more future housey. Although, in the absolute strangest way, the intro of this track also reminds me a lot of LRAD by Knife Party, and I can't be the only one who thinks that. But, you know, Northern Soul works in a way that it doesn't feel like it's trying to cram a super commercial big room sound down your throat or anything. Honestly, this feels a little bit more genuine than songs like Blue Sky Action from the We Are All We Need album. It feels a little bit more like a genuine progressive trance tune. I'd probably say I have a pretty similar reasoning as to why I like the track Is It Love so much. This one in particular surprised me a ton on my first listen of the album, mostly because it's just a straight progressive house track that falls right in the middle of the album. And this is like the good quality classic style of progressive house, not the cheap knockoff stuff. Maybe even a little bit of influence from Eric Prydz in there. Really, when it comes to the more dancey tracks on this album, those are really the only two that absolutely thrilled me. Although that's not to say there weren't other moments on this album that I found enjoyable. Per usual with Above and Beyond's albums, I really like the intro to this. The Inconsistency principle, I'd probably say, is a little bit less lighthearted than its counterparts on the last two Above and Beyond albums. It's got kind of an epic and cinematic sound to it. In fact, it sounds like something that could have fit very snug on the Interstellar soundtrack. Although I think that intro ends up going at least a little bit to waste because it's followed immediately by My Own Hymn, which in my opinion is one of the most lackluster tracks on the album. Next to the other generic chord progression, melody-driven tracks like Happiness Amplified, Tightrope, and All Right Now. In that way, I also think that the album's closer, which is also its title track, Common Ground, ends up being a pretty interesting cut on the record. It's not really super melody-centric, it doesn't have any vocals, which is super different compared to the rest of this album. It also uses a really interesting and different kind of chord progression, and then in the background you can kind of hear some world music elements kind of playing into it. There is one other song on this album that I thought really deserves some attention, and that's Sahara Love. And I'd say that's because I really don't think Above and Beyond has done anything like this song before. It's got a kind of driving, upbeat pop rock sound to it, which makes it stick out like a sore thumb in the album's track list, but honestly I don't care because this track is just so good to me. Honestly, most of the other songs on this track list that I haven't already mentioned either just stayed too stagnant for me or just didn't really do anything super interesting to captivate my attention. The song Naked is one that I've tried a little bit harder to like because it's talking about not being naked physically, but more or less just being real with our emotions and our actions. But the way that the hook is delivered on this song with the "Let's get naked" just makes it so I really can't take it seriously at all. Moving on, I guess there's really not a whole lot else to say. The songs on this album that stuck out to me, I feel like really only stuck out to me because they're so heavily surrounded by stuff that sounds like what we've heard Above and Beyond do so many times before. The album that I had hoped to be Above and Beyond's kind of grand return and showcase them kind of progressing in a new direction ended up being practically a carbon copy of their last album, and it really just kind of failed to encapture me even more than that. Now though, if you're an Above and Beyond fan, I'm going to issue you a little bit of a challenge. You can go ahead and dislike this video all you want, but really, you're hurting your own cause. I'm an Above and Beyond fan myself. I'd really like to see them make another great album. My challenge to you is to proactively support Above and Beyond's more forward-thinking music. Support songs like Sahara Love and the title track, add them to your Spotify playlist, share them with your friends, do whatever, but show Above and Beyond that you're more than willing to see them move into a new direction. Otherwise, in another 3 years, in 2021, we're going to get yet another one of these albums, and I'd really rather that not happen. Like I said, this album's not really repulsive in any way, they're really just reinventing the same machine for the third time, that's all. For Common Ground, I am feeling a strong 5 out of 10. As always, if you guys haven't listened to this album for yourselves, I do have the Spotify link down in the description so you can go check it out, and if you have listened to this album, make sure to let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Anyway, I'm Landon Remixes, I hope you guys enjoyed this review, and I'll catch you soon. Peace.